everyone, my name is Virginia Laurie Jennings, and I'm the author of The Alien Mind. Today I'm going to be reading you a short excerpt. In this book, Reeve is 14 years old, she's been raised by aliens, and now she's on Earth trying to learn how to blend in a little bit more. The class headed out the door. Reeve and Daniel collected their things and headed for the lunchroom. They were only halfway there when the school intercom came on. Reeve Tate, your mother has sent someone to pick you up. Please come to the main office. Reeve looked up at the intercom box. Yes, sir, she answered confusedly. Reeve, they can't hear you, Dan replied, looking at her. That can't be very efficient, Reeve said, frowning slightly. It works most of the time, Dan answered with a chuckle. By your mother, they mean Miss Tate, your caretaker, right? I assume so. However, she didn't inform me that we had to go anywhere. If you want, I'll walk with you to the office and then head to lunch, Dan offered. Sure, you can keep me from talking back to the intercoms that can't hear me, Reeve said, laughing. As they turned into the main hallway where the office was, Reeve stopped and walked over to look at some posters on the wall. What are you doing? Dan asked, going over to her. Do you see those men in black suits and dark glasses beside the office door? Reeve asked in a whisper. Yeah, Dan replied, lowering his voice as well. I just don't know. From the time I was captured by the Uruk, I've always been wary of beings that wish to keep their identity secret. I don't have any idea who those men are, except they'd only be here because of me. The secretary said that Miss Tate sent them. The school would have to hear from her directly if someone else is allowed to pick you up, so they must be okay, Daniel said with a confused look. That makes sense, I guess, Reeve said. How about I go first to see if I can find out who they are, Dan suggested. Dan left Reeve by the posters and approached the men by the office door. Afternoon, Dan said as he and Reeve stopped a few feet away from them. The men standing closest to the door looked Dan up and down. His gaze then drifted over to Reeve standing further away in the hall. Miss Tate sent us to come pick up Reeve, the man said to Dan, who then looked over at Reeve in the hall. The president wishes to meet with her. Dan looked back at Reeve, who nodded and stepped forward. I am Reeve. This is my friend Daniel Peterson. Good afternoon, Miss Reeve. I'm sorry if we made you nervous. I'm sorry. I've developed distrust about people who don't want their identities known. My friend agreed to help me put my suspicions at rest. No apology needed, the man replied, turning to nod at the three men and the one woman behind him, who took their glasses off as he did. Reeve smiled and nodded in gratitude. If you could come with us, the president wishes to speak with you. I will gladly come with you. Hold on, Reeve said, stopping as something alerted her mind. She looked toward one of the security cameras in the hall. Knowing that they were connected to the school's main computer, she let her mind amalgamate into the connection and into the mainframe, where she found the anomaly that had alerted her. All the school's computers were connected to the mainframe computer. One whole chain of these computers was crashing down synchronously. She then followed the camera connections into that end of the school. As she retreated back into her own mind, Dan could see her set her jaw firmly. What's wrong? Dan asked, as the suited men looked at her curiously. Fire in hallway 4. The alarm systems are faulty, Reeve said, turning then to the men. Students might be trapped. I'm going to go help. Stop! It's not safe, one of the men replied. You won't be able. I will because I can, Reeve replied sternly. Do you want my help, Reeve? Dan asked. No, the fire's too strong. You'd get burned. Make sure everyone else gets out, Reeve answered. Okay, Dan said as Reeve ran off. As Reeve approached the double doors that opened into the fourth hall, she could feel the heat radiating through them. Reeve held her palm in front of the closed doors and stepped through the middle of the door. Seeing the fire raging all around, she created an invisible bubble around herself, causing the flames to become useless as they flickered against her. Reeve heard yelling coming from the classroom halfway down the hall. She opened every door and checked inside for other people until she reached the door where she could hear the pleading calls. Realizing that the fire was stronger here than in the hallway, she decided it would be best to step through the door again instead of opening it. Where are you? She called above the flames. Back here, a young male's voice called, followed by a hacking cough. Reeve waved her hand and swept aside desks, books, and chairs. School textbooks burned brightly along the edges of the path that she had created. She walked steadily up to the wooden partition that separated a small section of the classroom from sight. Reeve feared to walking any faster, fearing she might lose her concentration and the bubble around her. which was the only thing keeping her from being burned. "We're back here! Some backpacks fell! I think my leg is broken!" Reevie walked to the opening at the end of the partition closest to her. Seeing a few students surrounded by the flames, Reevie forced her protective shield to extend around all of them before she did anything. The three boys turned white in shock as they realized the fire's heat was no longer affecting them. "Bill? Ed? Kurt?" Reevie asked, looking at the three of them over the pile on the floor that was Bill, jackets, and backpacks. "You? How did you get in here?" Bill questioned, although the pain in his leg was apparent in his voice. Reevie smiled slightly. "Things aren't always what they first seem," Reevie said flatly as she noticed a bunch of matches lying around the boys' feet. Bill noticed where Reevie's gaze fell, and his own face turned defiant, although Ed and Kurt looked guiltily at their feet. "Well, are you going to help us get help or not?" Bill demanded. "Help is already here," Reevie answered, narrowing her eyes. Bill stared at her blankly. Reevie's eyes closed briefly and then suddenly snapped wide open. Bill, Ed, and Kurt looked at Reevie in terror. Reevie stretched out her hands, palms up, and lifted her arms, bringing a pile of charred backpacks and coats up off the floor and onto the shelves above their heads. Watching the backpacks and coats, Bill, Ed, and Kurt shrank away from Reevie in fear. Reevie looked down at them sadly. "I won't hurt you, although this fire could have injured more than a few people today," Reevie said, kicking at a spent firecracker at her feet. "Ed, Kurt, I'll get you two out first. You two aren't injured." "The fire's too strong now. We'll never get out," Kurt answered, scared, and failing to remember that the fire was no longer endangering him thanks to Reevie's protective shield. "The fire has little effect on me," Reevie answered matter-of-factly. She stretched her hands out to the two boys who stepped around Bill, still sitting on the floor. They took her outstretched hands tentatively as Reevie led them to the opening of the partition. "Don't leave me here!" Bill called, terrified. Reevie released the two boys' hands as they stood out looking into the fiery classroom. Reevie's long brown hair flipped off her shoulders as she turned to look at Bill sitting on the floor. "Don't worry, I won't," Reevie answered gently. She placed a hand between the shoulder blades of the two boys' backs, and drawing her shield in around them, she led them through the fiery classroom. As they reached the classroom door, Ed held the back of his hand toward the door. "It's too hot to open," he said. Reevie said nothing, but pushed them screaming through the closed door. They stopped screaming once they realized they'd walked through the door, and continued in shocked silence through the burning hall and toward the door to the exit. Again, Reevie pushed them through the doors and into the safety of the schoolyard, where students and teachers were all gathered together. Ed and Kurt stumbled towards the nearest teacher, who was looking past them and at Reevie, who had only come halfway through the door. Reevie withdrew herself back into the burning hallway. She walked back to where Bill was lying unconscious, having been overcome by the smoke. "I never liked doing this," Reevie told herself as she waved her hand over Bill, making him lighter than air and causing him to float. Reevie grimaced, knowing that it was much easier for Aeon healers to manipulate the atoms in a person's body, so doing this would surely sap her strength. She held her hands under his levitated body and guided him back through the fiery hallway where she had just led his friends. By the time she stepped outside, Dan, the dark-suited men, and the newly arrived firefighters had also joined the students and teachers. As she floated Bill through the outer door and into the fresh air, the firefighters were the first to rush to her side. Dan and the president's men wisely held back. Reevie lowered Bill to the cool grass as the smoke-free air began to bring Bill back to consciousness. Reevie fell to her knees, and a firefighter immediately pushed an oxygen mask to her face. Reevie took a deep breath, coughed, and then pushed the mask away. Closing her eyes, she ignored the protesting firefighter, and with the last of her mental strength, she stretched her shaking arms toward the sky. Choosing only oxygen atoms, she brought her arms down and breathed deeply a few times. When she opened her eyes and found a few firefighters carrying Bill on a gurney toward the medical truck, the fireman holding the oxygen mask looked at her perplexedly. Reevie managed a small smile. "I'm fine now, but thank you," she said weakly, nodding to him as he stood up, still looking confused. She got up and walked past the stunned students and staff and over to Dan and the men. "You okay, Reevie? You look exhausted," Dan said, concerned. "I am, but I'll be fine. Let's go and have that talk with the president," Reevie said, turning tiredly to look at the men. "Right this way," one of the men said, motioning towards two black SUVs parked along the edge of the schoolyard on the curb. Reevy shuffled toward the vehicles until Dan offered to help. He took her arm and brought it around his neck to help support her. After a few more steps, her legs went limp, and he scooped her up into his arms. "Thanks," Reevy mumbled as she rested her head against his shoulder. "I'm both mentally and physically exhausted." "What are friends for?" he said more than asked, as he carried her toward the vehicles. Chapter 6. Civic Duty. Reevy awoke sitting on the leather seat of a vehicle and propped against the window. She lifted her head and looked around to find Dan sitting next to her and staring out the opposite window. He turned toward her in surprise. "That was quite some nap you took there. You hardly moved a muscle. Mr. I don't have a name up there suggested that we stop and see if you were still alive," Dan said jokingly as he motioned toward the man driving the vehicle. "I haven't strained my abilities that far in a long time. My mental and physical functions just shut down. I'm neither a healer nor an element shifter, so lifting Bill and going through all that fire really tired me out," Reevy answered, thinking over the memory. "Plus, you've probably been a bit out of practice while you were here on Earth because you were trying to keep your identity a secret," Dan replied. "Yes," Reevy answered. "It felt good to have a reason not to hide, though." "Well, you certainly gave those kids something to talk about," the driver said, glancing in the rearview mirror. "Earth had to be brought out of the dark sometime. I just didn't think it would be this soon," Reevy added. Wouldn't sooner have been better than later?" Dan asked. "I don't know," Reevy replied. "I'm not a futurity histographer like my guardian father Ank, but I do know that this meeting with the president is now really important." Thank you. Once again, this has been The Alien Mind, read by me, the author. You can find more about the alien mind and all the other works that I've written at www.virginialauriejennings.com.